Insurance Business TV was recently in San Diego, attending the WSIA Annual Marketplace Conference. Whilst there, we caught up with leading insurance professionals who addressed some of the top challenges the industry is facing today.
Yeah, I think as we move more into an era of specialization, I think it's really incumbent upon brokers and carriers to be working together to identify where those coverage gaps are. There's an increased need for collaboration and education, quite frankly, of our clients. And I think we're all in an era of escalating exposures as well. So we're seeing exposures that 10, 20 years ago we didn't see. So some of the things that come to mind for me are cyber. There's never going to be one policy that off the shelf provides everything that a client needs. So identifying where those potential gaps are between a property policy and a cyber policy, for example, is critical. I think another opportunity for us is environmental. As we see pollution regulations and laws, climate change regulations change globally, quite frankly, it's changing the liability and the onus on the client, and how are policies going to respond to that, and where do we potentially need some amendments within those policies, which I think is also a huge opportunity, quite frankly, for the E&S world specifically, is because we have more flexibility and more specialization to tailor those coverages to what clients need. We aren't beholden by kind of the off-the-shelf file forms that maybe some of our admitted counterparts would be. I think it's the collaboration aspect. So we work in silos. We so easily silo ourselves. So I say, well, I'm in property underwriting, so I don't need to know anything that's happening with any other line of business, or I'm in cyber underwriting, or I'm in environmental underwriting, and we silo ourselves. So I think it's breaking down those silos. I think it's also making sure that we're increasing collaboration with our brokers. It's not an adversarial relationship. We both depend on each other to ultimately deliver the product that the clients need. So having a conversation with a broker and not being afraid to say, I think that this client might have some exposure here, and I don't know that the policy picks this up. What other policies does this client provide, and where can we identify some of those potential gaps? And then what products are available out there, or quite frankly, what products need to be developed that also offers an opportunity for brokers and carriers to partner together to develop those products. Yeah, I think the one that everybody keeps talking about is that secondary perils are not secondary perils anymore, right? So 10 years ago, convective storm wasn't a driver of the market, but at this point, convective storm, wildfire, and flooding are all major drivers, and they're much higher frequency. So the traditional cat perils that you would look at of earthquake and named storm, those happen very infrequently. Obviously, the severity is quite high, but what we're seeing with some of those so-called secondary perils is both a frequency and a severity issue. The cat modeling tools that we've traditionally relied on haven't necessarily caught up yet. They're still trying to figure out how do you identify where the convective storm exposure is, because it is, quite frankly, significantly more erratic and volatile. We know where hurricanes are going to hit. You don't necessarily have that same level of confidence in convective storms. I think we've also seen with things like the winter freezes, our reliance on the energy grid and quite frankly, the fragility of the energy grid is something that hadn't historically been taken into account in underwriting. So how do you look at a client's dependence on energy and the potential long-term business interruption exposure from something like a winter storm, specifically after what we saw in Uri in Texas, but even again, convective storm, wildfire, all of those are things that the industry now has to look at from both a frequency and a severity basis. Well, I think when you look at events that are happening in areas that you never thought about before. So I'm from Atlanta. I grew up going to the mountains of North Carolina. Nobody ever would have expected Hurricane Helene to cause the damage that it caused in Western North Carolina. That was an area, it's a mountainous area. You wouldn't think that you would be subject to that level of hurricane-based flooding, but they were and they are. And quite frankly, their infrastructure was not set up for it. Florida, for example, their infrastructure is set up to endure hurricanes. Even California, their infrastructure is set up, their construction codes are set up to endure earthquakes. Because we're seeing more and more events that are impacting areas that aren't prepared for it and that don't have the necessary infrastructure, it's a real challenge to underwrite it, because you start thinking about some of the other long-term impacts too. What is the impact on valuation when you see demand surge or labor surge and you can't can't get materials into Western North Carolina, for example, because the roads are all gone. So what does that do to the business interruption loss that you underwrote to? What does that do to the property valuation that you underwrote to? And so how do clients accurately value their risks when they are in some of those areas that they wouldn't necessarily expect a risk, but now they've got to prepare for it? And how do underwriters underwrite to that risk? I think we've got a real seat at the table now, right? So the E&S market, we're now about 10% of the premium volume in the property insurance market, which has almost doubled since 2020. Again, that gives us a real seat at the table. And I think the biggest lever that we have is that specialization and the fact that we are able to tailor our coverages to what those clients need. Again, as we're seeing more volatility in risks, more volatility in losses, clients are having to look at risks differently. We're seeing admitted markets make some decisions to pull out of certain geographies because of the volatility. And that's where E&S carriers can really come in and make a clear difference.